My wife called my mother a fat pig right at our wedding reception, and I stood there like a coward, too shocked to defend her. The shame was crushing me when her wealthy father suddenly stared at my humble mother and gasped, "Aren't you the one who—" He never finished that sentence, but something in that moment told me my ordinary mother was anything but ordinary. Before we dive deeper into what happened at that wedding reception, tell me in the comments, what country or city are you watching from? The wedding was everything Brittany had dreamed of at the Omni Grove Park Inn in Asheville. October leaves painted the Blue Ridge Mountains in brilliant colors, creating a backdrop fit for her Mitchell family legacy standards. I'm Marcus Thompson, 32, senior marketing manager from Charlotte. I'd saved 3 years to afford this wedding for the woman I thought was perfect. Brittany Mitchell was everything I wasn't, sophisticated, polished from wealth I could only dream about. My mother, Patricia 60, had arrived in a simple navy Macy's dress and grandmother's pearls. She lived modestly on Dad's pension since he passed 5 years ago. Nothing flashy, just my understated mom. The ceremony went perfectly. Brittany looked radiant in her designer gown, and her parents Richard and Paula Mitchell beamed from the front row. Richard owned businesses around Charlotte, though he'd had financial troubles recently. Still, they maintained their country club lifestyle. During the reception, I was talking with college friends when Brittany approached with her parents. "Marcus, honey," she called with that sweet southern charm, "I want Mom and Dad to properly meet your mother." I spotted Mom at a corner table, watching the festivities with her gentle smile. She never sought attention, preferring to observe others' happiness. "Of course," I said, leading them over. Mom stood gracefully extending her hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for welcoming me into your family. You've raised a wonderful daughter." Paula's smile was politely measured. "How lovely to meet you properly, Patricia." That's when Brittany decided to share her thoughts. "You know," she laughed like breaking glass, "Marcus has been so worried about impressing you both. I keep telling him not to stress. We all have family we're embarrassed about, right?" She gestured dismissively toward my mother. "Look at her. Bless her heart, she tries, but she's basically just a fat pig in pearls." The words hit like a physical blow. Conversation stopped. My face burned with shock and rage. Mom's face went still, but I caught the flash of pain before she composed herself. "Brittany," I started, voice shaking with anger, but Richard Mitchell was staring at my mother with an expression I couldn't read. His face had gone pale, eyes fixed on her with intensity that seemed almost like recognition. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard Mitchell's face, heard those words, $800 million. By 7 a.m., I was standing outside Mom's apartment door in Charlotte, my finger hovering over the doorbell. She answered on the first ring as if she'd been expecting me. Her hair was already done coffee brewing in the kitchen, but her eyes held the weight of someone who hadn't slept either. "We need to talk," I said. She stepped aside without a word, and I followed her into the familiar living room where I'd spent countless Sunday afternoons. The same floral couch Dad had bought her for their 20th anniversary. The same family photos on the mantle. Everything looked exactly as it always had, yet somehow felt like a complete lie. "Mom, what Richard said last night." "Marcus, sit down." Her voice was gentler than I expected. "Please." I remained standing, too agitated to sit. $800 million, Mom. He said someone paid $800 million for his company, and he thinks it was you. I laughed, but it came out bitter. "That's insane, right? Tell me that's insane." She was quiet for a long moment, studying her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with something I'd never seen before. A deep, weary sadness. "Do you remember your father's last project?" she asked softly. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Answer me, sweetheart. Do you remember what he was working on before he got sick?" I frowned, trying to recall. "Something about battery technology. Cell phone batteries, I think. He was always tinkering with circuits and power management systems in the garage." She nodded slowly. "Your father was brilliant, Marcus. More brilliant than either of us ever let on. That tinkering, you remember. It was a revolutionary power management system that could triple the battery life of mobile devices." My legs suddenly felt weak. I sank onto the couch. "In 2012, 2 years before he passed, we sold his patent." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We thought we might get enough to retire comfortably. Maybe take that trip to Ireland he'd always talked about." "At how much?" The words scraped out of my throat. $25 million. The number hung in the air between us like a physical presence. 25 million. While I was working 60-hour weeks to afford my mortgage while I was saving every penny for my wedding, my parents had been sitting on $25 million. Why didn't you tell me? My voice cracked like a teenager's. Because your father and I made a decision. Tears were forming in her eyes now. We wanted you to build your own life, earn your own success. We were so proud of the man you were becoming, hardworking, honest, independent. We didn't want money to change that. But $25 million. I shook my head trying to process it all. That was just the beginning, sweetheart. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Your father taught me how to invest. We were careful, strategic. Over the years, that money grew. My mouth went dry. How much did it grow, Mom? She looked directly at me then, and I saw the woman Richard Mitchell had recognized, someone used to making very important decisions. Enough to buy Reynolds Holdings when it was failing, she said quietly. Enough to save Richard's company and protect the jobs of 300 employees. The room spun around me. My modest coupon-clipping Honda-driving mother was telling me she was rich enough to buy entire corporations. I stared at her, my mind reeling. You bought an entire company. Marcus, I need you to understand something. Mom leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. Your father and I, we weren't just engineers who got lucky. We were strategic. When that first check came in for $25 million, we didn't go buy mansions or fancy cars. Obviously, I said, gesturing around her modest apartment. We studied the market like it was another engineering problem to solve. Your father had this gift for spotting undervalued opportunities before anyone else noticed them. We started with conservative investments, then moved into growth companies, real estate in emerging markets, tech startups with solid foundations. She stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out what looked like a photo album. But when she opened it, I saw it was filled with financial documents, charts, investment records. Every decision was calculated. Every risk was measured. She sat back down, the album in her lap. By the time your father passed 5 years ago, our portfolio was worth considerably more than that initial $25 million. How much more? My voice sounded hollow. Enough that when Reynolds Holdings was drowning in debt 3 years ago, I could step in anonymously and save it. Not for Richard Mitchell. He was a terrible businessman who nearly destroyed a perfectly good company. But for the employees, the families who depended on those jobs, I felt like I was learning about a completely different person. But why hide it from me all these years, watching me struggle to pay off student loans, save for a housework over time, just to afford my wedding? Her face crumpled slightly. Because we were so proud of you, sweetheart. You were building something real, something yours. You earned every promotion, every achievement through your own merit. Do you know how rare that is? How precious? But I could have... What relaxed, stop trying? Let money solve your problems. She shook her head firmly. We've seen what wealth does to young people who don't earn it. It robs them of purpose, of the satisfaction that comes from genuine accomplishment. I thought about some of my wealthy college friends, the ones who'd never held real jobs, who drifted from one expensive hobby to another. You could have told me after I was established. I planned to, someday. When you were older, maybe when you had children of your own. She closed the album with a soft thud. I never expected Richard Mitchell to recognize me at your wedding. So what happens now? Mom was quiet for a moment, and when she looked at me again, there was something new in her expression. Something that looked almost like fear. Now we deal with the consequences of last night. Because, Marcus, there's something else you need to understand. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The $25 million from your father's patent, the smart investments over the years. That's not the whole story. My stomach clenched. What do you mean? The battery technology your father developed. It wasn't just one patent. It was the foundation for an entire ecosystem of innovations. Licensing agreements, subsidiary patents, royalty streams that continue to this day. She met my eyes directly. That modest portfolio I mentioned, it's worth considerably more than what I paid for Reynolds Holdings. How much more? She took a deep breath. There's more you need to know, son. Much more. 3 days after my conversation with Mom, Brittany called, with a voice so sweet it could have caused diabetes. Marcus, honey. I've been thinking about what happened at the reception. She said, her tone completely different from the venom she'd spat at my mother. I feel just terrible about how I spoke. I think we should all have lunch together. You know, as a family. I was sitting in my office staring at quarterly reports that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the bombshell Mom had dropped. "Brittany, you called my mother a fat pig in front of 200 people. I know, and I'm mortified. I was just so nervous about impressing Daddy, and you know how I get when I'm anxious." Her laugh tinkled like wind chimes. "But after what Daddy said about that business thing, well, I think there might be some misunderstandings we should clear up." There it was, the real reason for her sudden change of heart. What kind of misunderstandings? "Oh, you know, family financial planning, making sure we're all on the same page about the future. I made us a reservation at the Capitol Grill for tomorrow at noon. Somewhere nice where we can really talk." The Capitol Grill, the most expensive restaurant in Charlotte where a single meal costs more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Of course, that's where Brittany wanted to meet. The next day I arrived to find Brittany already seated at a prime table, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She'd ordered a bottle of wine that I recognized from a magazine article about wines for the 1%. "Darling." She stood to kiss my cheek as if nothing had happened. "Doesn't your mother look lovely?" Mom had arrived wearing the same navy dress from the wedding, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the restaurant's opulent atmosphere. But she smiled graciously as Brittany guided us to our seats. "Patricia, I owe you such an apology." Brittany began, her eyes sparkling with manufactured sincerity. "I was completely out of line the other night. Wedding stress, you understand. I hope you can forgive me." "Of course, dear," Mom replied, though I noticed her fingers tighten slightly around her water glass. "I'm so glad because I've been doing some research about family wealth management, and I have some exciting ideas I'd love to share." Brittany pulled out a leather portfolio that looked like it had cost more than my car payment. "You see, I studied business at Wharton, and I understand how important it is to structure family assets properly." I felt my stomach drop. "Brittany, what are you talking about?" Well, after what Daddy said about that investment situation, I started thinking about tax implications, estate planning, that sort of thing. She opened the portfolio to reveal neatly organized documents. "I've been consulting with some financial advisors, and they all agree that the best approach for families with significant assets is to establish a formal trust structure." Mom's expression didn't change, but I saw her shoulders tense. "I'm thinking we should start with something substantial, maybe $20 million, to establish credibility in the philanthropic community. We could call it the Thompson Family Foundation." Brittany's smile was radiant as she slid a preliminary document across the table. "I've already drafted some initial paperwork. The foundation would be managed by a board of family trustees, you, me, and Marcus. Equal votes, very democratic." I stared at the document, my mind racing. Equal votes meant Brittany and I could outvote my mother on any decision involving what she was proposing to be $20 million of Mom's money. "Hey, this is very thoughtful of you, Brittany," Mom said carefully, "but perhaps a bit premature." "Oh, but that's exactly why we need to act quickly." Brittany leaned forward eagerly. "The tax advantages alone could save us millions, and think of the good we could do for the community." I watched Brittany spread more documents across the white tablecloth, her manicured nails tapping excitedly against each page. The enthusiasm in her voice was unsettling. This wasn't the woman who'd been indifferent to my family for 8 months of dating. "Now the beautiful thing about this structure," she continued, pulling out what looked like organizational charts, "is that it gives us all a voice in major financial decisions while protecting the assets from unnecessary taxes." Us all, I asked slowly. "The family board, of course. 3 trustees with equal representation." She pointed to neat little boxes on her diagram. "Patricia as the founding member, you as the next generation, and me as the newest family member. Very democratic, very fair." I did the math quickly. In any vote, Brittany and I would constitute a 2/3 majority. If she could convince me to side with her on any decision, Mom would be outvoted on her own money. "Brittany," I said carefully, "this seems like something that requires a lot more thought and professional consultation." "Oh, but I have consulted professionals." She beamed, pulling out another folder. "I've already spoken with Harrison Wells and Associates. They're the premier estate planning firm in Charlotte. They think this structure is brilliant." Mom finally spoke, her voice calm, but with an edge I recognized from my childhood when she was particularly displeased. "You've discussed my personal financial situation with lawyers." "Well, not specifics, of course, just hypothetical scenarios involving significant family wealth." Brittany's smile never wavered. "They were very impressed with the preliminary structure I proposed." The word hypothetical rang hollow. I thought about the timing. 3 days since the wedding revelation, and Brittany had already consulted estate planning attorneys and drafted formal documents. This wasn't spontaneous concern for family welfare, this was a calculated strategy. And the initial funding of $20 million, I said, testing her, that's just to start? Exactly. Think of it as seed money to establish our philanthropic presence. Once we proved the foundation's effectiveness, we could expand significantly. Her eyes lit up like she was discussing Christmas presents. I'm envisioning annual galas, charity auctions, maybe even a scholarship program. The Thompson name could become synonymous with Charlotte's charitable community. The Thompson name, not the Mitchell name, not even hyphenated. She wanted to build a social empire using my mother's money and our family reputation. I've even identified some preliminary charitable focuses. She continued, flipping to another page. Education, healthcare, maybe some arts programs. Things that would really make a splash in the society pages. Society pages. There it was. The real motivation. Brittany wasn't interested in helping people. She wanted the social status that came with being a major philanthropist. She wanted to be the young, beautiful face of a $20 million foundation, attending galas and charity events as the generous benefactor. I looked across the table at my mother, who was listening with the polite attention she'd perfected over decades of social situations. But I could see the calculation in her eyes, the same analytical mind that had turned $25 million into enough money to buy entire corporations. As this is quite comprehensive, Brittany, Mom said finally. You've clearly put a lot of thought into this. I have. And the best part is we could have everything finalized within a month. Harrison Wells and Associates said they could fast-track the paperwork if we're ready to move forward. Fast-track, of course. Get the money committed before anyone had time to think too carefully about the implications. I watched my wife, this woman I thought I knew, thought I loved, laying out her plans to systematically gain control over my mother's fortune, and felt something cold settle in my chest. The eager gleam in her eyes, the calculated enthusiasm, the way she'd already spoken to lawyers about our family's private business. This wasn't the woman I'd married, or maybe it was, and I'd just been too blind to see it. 2 days after lunch, I found the invoice in Brittany's purse while looking for my phone charger. Sterling Investigations, $3,500. Services background. Financial research and asset verification. Client B, Mitchell Thompson. Line items included corporate ownership structure analysis and anonymous investor identification services. She'd hired a private investigator to research my mother. Brittany, I called out. She emerged from the bathroom perfectly styled as always. What's wrong, honey? I held up the invoice. Want to explain this? Her face cycled through surprise calculation, then that practiced smile. Oh, that. I was just trying to understand our family's financial situation better. For the foundation planning. You hired investigators to spy on my mother. I wouldn't call it spying, more like due diligence. She sat on our bed, patting the space beside her. After what Daddy said at the wedding, I needed to understand what we were dealing with. I remained standing. You've been investigating my family behind my back. I was protecting our interests, Marcus. If your mother really has significant assets, don't you think you have a right to know? Her voice took on that reasonable tone she used to make manipulation sound logical. Our interests. Since when do you care about my mother? 3 days ago, you called her a fat pig. I apologized for that. I was wrong. Stop! The word came out sharp. Stop with the excuses and fake concern. Her mask slipped. I don't know what you mean. The foundation with voting structure to outvote my mother. Meeting with lawyers before talking to us. Private investigators. I waved the invoice. This isn't family planning. This is about money. Of course it's about money. Her voice rose genuine emotion, replacing calculated sweetness. Do you have any idea what this opportunity represents? If your mother has hundreds of millions, we could be set for life. Then we could take it from her? Not take it, manage it properly. Make sure it benefits the whole family instead of sitting in conservative accounts. She was pacing now, composure gone. Our children could be set for life. We could have everything we've ever dreamed of. I never dreamed of stealing from my mother. It's not stealing if it's family money. I stared at this woman I'd promised to love and honor, seeing her clearly for the first time. Brittany, I need you to answer something honestly. She stopped pacing. When you agreed to marry me 8 months ago, did you know about my mother's money? Marcus, that's not... Did you marry me for money? The silence that followed was answer enough. That evening, I sat in Mom's living room while she pulled out files I'd never seen before. Corporate documents, acquisition papers, financial statements, with numbers that made my head spin. "You asked for the whole truth," she said quietly. "The portfolio I mentioned, it's worth $800 million, Marcus. $800 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. The Reynolds Holdings acquisition 3 years ago wasn't just an investment, it was personal." She opened a thick folder. Richard Mitchell had run that company into the ground with reckless expansion and poor debt management. 300 employees were about to lose their jobs. "So you bought it?" "Through a shell company, yes. Mitchell Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware, managed by a team of lawyers and financial advisors. Richard never knew who the real buyer was." She showed me the acquisition documents. "I paid $750 million to save his company." I stared at the papers. "You spent almost your entire fortune to save the company of a man whose daughter just called you a fat pig." "I didn't do it for Richard. I did it for the families who depended on those paychecks, for the engineers like your father who'd built something worthwhile." Her voice was steady, but I caught the emotion underneath. Under proper management, Reynolds Holdings became profitable again within 18 months. And Richard never knew. He thought he'd sold to some corporate investment firm. I arranged for him to keep a consulting position, partly out of pity, partly to maintain appearances. She closed the folder. The irony is that his current lifestyle, the country club, the estate, his daughter's expensive education, it's all funded by the very company I saved from his mismanagement. My phone buzzed. A text from Brittany. "We need to talk, all of us, tomorrow." Mom saw my expression. "What is it?" I showed her the message. "I think Brittany's figured out more than we realized." The next morning, Brittany arrived at Mom's apartment with a leather briefcase and an expression I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, completely devoid of the sweet facade she usually wore. "Patricia," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I think it's time we discussed your financial situation honestly." "I think we've discussed enough," Mom replied calmly. Brittany opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. Sterling Investigations was very thorough. Shell companies, acquisition records, corporate filings. "It's all here. You're not just wealthy, Patricia. You're extraordinarily wealthy." I felt sick watching my wife lay out evidence of her investigation, like a prosecutor presenting a case. "What do you want, Brittany?" I asked. "What I've always wanted. What's fair for this family?" She pulled out what looked like legal documents. "I've consulted with Harrison Wells and Associates. They've prepared a formal proposal for restructuring the family assets." "I'm not restructuring anything," Mom said firmly. "Actually, you might want to reconsider." Brittany's smile was razor sharp. "Because if you don't agree to a reasonable settlement, let's say $50 million transferred to a family trust, I'll be forced to file complaints with the SEC about potential violations in your corporate acquisition practices." The room went completely silent. "Are you threatening my mother?" My voice was barely controlled. "I'm protecting my family's interests. Anonymous acquisitions, shell companies, undisclosed beneficial ownership. These things can look very suspicious to regulatory authorities." She closed her briefcase with a sharp snap. "Of course, if we can reach a family agreement, there'd be no need for outside scrutiny." Mom stood slowly, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw something dangerous in her eyes. "Brittany," she said quietly, "you have no idea who you're threatening." 1 week later, we sat in the polished conference room of Harrison Wells and Associates. The mahogany table reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, and I felt like I was attending my own family's funeral. Brittany had arrived with her own attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Vance, who specialized in family wealth disputes. Mom brought James Sullivan, her longtime financial advisor, and a lawyer I'd never met before. "Let's be clear about why we're here." Catherine Vance began adjusting her expensive glasses. "My client has discovered that Mrs. Thompson has been concealing considerable assets while allowing her son's wife's family to suffer financial hardship." "Suffer?" James Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Mitchell has been receiving consulting fees of $200,000 annually from Reynolds Holdings for the past 3 years. Brittany's face flushed slightly. She hadn't known about that detail. "That's irrelevant," Catherine continued smoothly. "The issue is disclosure and family responsibility. My client proposes a settlement of $15 million to establish a family trust managed jointly by all parties." $15 million. She'd increased her demand from the 50 million threat. Mrs. Thompson. Catherine leaned forward. My client is prepared to file complaints with multiple regulatory agencies regarding your anonymous corporate acquisitions. The SEC takes undisclosed beneficial ownership very seriously. Mom's lawyer, a distinguished man named Robert Chen, finally spoke. Ms. Vance, are you threatening my client with frivolous regulatory complaints unless she pays your client $15 million? Because that sounds remarkably like extortion. It's not extortion to seek fair family financial planning. Brittany interjected, her voice tight with frustration. Marcus has a right to know about his inheritance. I have a right to understand my family's financial situation. Your family? I found my voice for the first time since we'd sat down. Brittany, you've been married to me for exactly 1 week, long enough to discover that your mother has been lying to both of us for years. The words hung in the air like poison. Mom sat perfectly still, but I saw her hands clench slightly in her lap. James Sullivan opened a folder. Mrs. Mitchell Thompson, let me share some information your investigators apparently missed. Your father's consulting contract includes a clause that it can be terminated at any time without cause. Your family's mortgage payments have been mysteriously covered by an anonymous benefactor for the past 18 months. Your mother's country club membership also anonymously funded. Brittany's face went white. What are you saying? I'm saying that your family's lifestyle has been quietly subsidized by the same woman you're now threatening to destroy. James's voice was calm, but deadly. Mrs. Thompson has been protecting your family's dignity while you've been planning to rob her. Catherine Vance shifted uncomfortably. That doesn't change the legal issues surrounding... There are no legal issues, Robert Chen interrupted. Every acquisition, every corporate structure, every financial decision has been properly documented and legally executed. Your threats are baseless. Brittany looked between her lawyer and her parents, panic creeping into her eyes. But the SEC complaint will be dismissed immediately after a preliminary review, Chen said firmly. And then Mrs. Thompson will file counter-complaints for harassment and attempted extortion. The room fell silent, except for the hum of air conditioning. I watched my wife realize that her carefully planned assault was crumbling around her. Mom finally spoke, her voice quiet, but carrying absolute authority. Brittany, you've made your position very clear. Now let me make mine clear. She stood slowly, and everyone in the room seemed to lean forward slightly. I have a counteroffer. Mom's voice cut through the conference room like a blade. $3 million. Everyone stared at her. I will write you a check for $3 million, Brittany. Cash settlement, no questions asked, no legal complications. Mom's eyes never left my wife's face. In exchange, you will sign a separation agreement, file for divorce from my son, and never contact our family again. The silence was deafening. $3 million. Brittany's voice cracked slightly. Take it or leave it. The offer expires when I walk out of this room. Catherine Vance leaned over to whisper urgently in Brittany's ear, but Mom continued. Or you can pursue your regulatory complaints, face countersuits for extortion and harassment, watch your father lose his consulting contract, and your family lose their home. Mom's tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather. Your choice. I watched my wife's face cycle through emotions, shock, calculation, greed, fear. The woman I thought I'd married was doing math, weighing $3 million guaranteed dollars against years of expensive litigation with uncertain outcomes. That's not enough, Brittany stammered. $15 million was reasonable for... $3 million is more than you'll see in a lifetime of lawsuits against me, Mom interrupted. And it comes with something priceless. My silence about your investigation tactics and attempted extortion. James Sullivan slid a document across the table. The separation agreement is already prepared. Sign it and the money transfers immediately. Brittany looked at her parents. Richard Mitchell had gone pale, finally understanding that his daughter's greed had jeopardized everything. Paula sat frozen, probably calculating how long $3 million would sustain their lifestyle. I need time to think, Brittany said weakly. No, Mom stood up. You have 30 seconds to decide. After that, you get nothing except a very expensive legal battle you will lose. Catherine Vance was frantically whispering to her client, no doubt explaining that $3 million in hand was better than $15 million in lengthy, costly litigation. I found my voice. Brittany, just take the money. She looked at me with something that might have been surprise. Marcus, take the money and go. Please. I felt exhausted, drained of everything except the desire for this nightmare to end. We both know this marriage was over the moment you hired those investigators. Tears formed in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from genuine emotion or frustration at her failed plan. 20 seconds, Mom said calmly. Brittany grabbed the pen from the table and signed the separation agreement with shaking hands. The sound of her signature scratching across the paper felt like a door slamming shut on the biggest mistake of my life. James Sullivan immediately initiated the wire transfer from his phone. $3 million will be in your account within the hour. Brittany stood unsteadily, her face a mixture of triumph and defeat. She'd gotten $3 million, but lost the chance at $800 million. I hope you're happy, she said, looking between Mom and me. I'm free, I replied. That's enough. She left without another word, Catherine Vance trailing behind with her briefcase full of useless legal threats. 2 hours later, I sat in Mom's living room, officially separated from my wife of 1 week, watching her pack what remained of Brittany's belongings into boxes. Do you regret it? I asked. $3 million to protect my son from a woman who married him for money. Mom smiled sadly. That's the best investment I've ever made. 6 months later, I was volunteering at a local literacy program when I met Sarah Chen, a third-grade teacher with paint-stained fingers and the most genuine smile I'd ever seen. You're really good with the kids, she said, after I'd helped a struggling reader sound out words for an hour. Have you considered teaching? I work in marketing. I replied, then found myself adding, but honestly, this feels more meaningful than anything I'd do at the office. Sarah laughed a sound like wind chimes that had nothing calculated about it. That's exactly how I felt when I left corporate law to become a teacher. My parents thought I'd lost my mind. We started talking, and I discovered she lived in a tiny apartment near the school, drove a Honda older than mine, and spent her own money on classroom supplies. When she mentioned splitting a pizza for dinner, because teacher budgets don't allow for fancy restaurants, I felt something I hadn't experienced with Brittany, complete comfort with simplicity. Our first real date was a picnic in Freedom Park. Sarah brought homemade sandwiches and lemonade in a thermos. We talked about books, her students' progress, my volunteer work. She never asked about my job title, my car, or where I lived. She seemed genuinely interested in who I was, not what I had. My mom would love you, I said, as we watched kids play on the playground. I'd like to meet her. You talk about her with such respect. Sarah smiled. That says a lot about a man. 3 months into dating, I finally brought Sarah to meet Mom. I'd been nervous, not about Mom's approval, but about Sarah's reaction to learning about our family's complicated financial situation. Mrs. Thompson, thank you for raising such a thoughtful son, Sarah said, hugging Mom like she'd known her for years. Mom's eyes met mine over Sarah's shoulder, and I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Pure joy. We had dinner at Mom's apartment. Sarah complimented the simple meal, helped clear dishes without being asked, and listened with genuine interest as Mom shared stories about Dad's engineering work. Marcus mentioned your husband was an inventor, Sarah said. That must have been exciting seeing his ideas come to life. It was, Mom replied carefully. He was very talented. Sarah nodded. Marcus has that same creative problem-solving mind. He found this amazing way to help one of my struggling readers by turning math problems into stories. I watched Mom's face light up as Sarah talked about my volunteer work, my patience with difficult kids, my genuine care for others. Here was someone who valued me for qualities that had nothing to do with bank accounts or corporate acquisitions. Later, as I walked Sarah to her car, she took my hand. Your mom is wonderful. I can see where you get your kindness. She paused. And I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, but you both seem like you've been through something difficult recently. There's a sadness in your eyes sometimes. I squeezed her hand. We have, but it's getting better. Good, because you deserve happiness, Marcus Thompson. Standing there under the streetlight holding hands with a woman who loved me for who I was rather than what my family had, I realized Mom had been right all along. The most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, inherited, or stolen. They had to be earned through authenticity, kindness, and the courage to love without conditions. Looking back now, I realized that my mother's greatest gift wasn't the $800 million she'd quietly accumulated over 15 years. It was the wisdom to know that money without character is worthless, and character without struggle is shallow. She could have told me about our wealth when I was 25, struggling to pay off student loans. She could have made my life easier, eliminated my financial stress, given me every advantage money could buy. Instead, she gave me something far more valuable, the chance to become a man worthy of respect, someone who earned his achievements through dedication and integrity. When I think about Brittany now, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel pity. She saw $800 million and thought she'd found the answer to happiness. What she'd actually found was a test she failed spectacularly. She chose greed over love, manipulation over honesty. And in the end, she walked away with $3 million, but lost the chance at something priceless. A family that valued her for who she was, not what she could take. The irony isn't lost on me that Mom spent nearly her entire fortune to save the company of a man whose daughter tried to destroy our family. But that's who she is, someone who sees beyond personal slights to do what's right. She didn't save Reynolds Holdings for Richard Mitchell. She saved it for 300 families who needed those jobs. Sarah understands this instinctively. When I finally told her about our family's wealth, carefully gradually after we'd been dating for 8 months, her first question wasn't about what it meant for us. It was whether Mom was okay carrying such a heavy responsibility alone. That must be incredibly isolating, Sarah said, holding my hand as we sat in her tiny apartment. Having to hide such a fundamental part of yourself to protect the people you love. That's when I knew I was going to marry her. Not because she didn't care about the money, but because she understood the burden that came with it. Today, Mom and I have a relationship built on complete honesty. She's teaching me about investments, philanthropy, and the responsibility that comes with wealth. But more importantly, she's teaching me about the values that matter when everything else is stripped away. Compassion, integrity, the courage to do right even when it costs you everything. We've quietly established the Thomas Thompson Foundation, named after my father, focusing on supporting young inventors and engineers from modest backgrounds. No galas, no society pages, no recognition, just the satisfaction of giving talented people the opportunities they deserve. The foundation's first scholarship recipient was a young woman from rural North Carolina who developed an innovative water purification system but couldn't afford to patent it. Watching her present her work at a national engineering conference, seeing the pride in her parents' eyes, reminded me why Mom kept her wealth secret for so long. The most meaningful victories are the ones you earn yourself. If you're listening to this story, I want you to ask yourself something. What would you do if you discovered your family had been hiding enormous wealth? Would you be angry about the deception or grateful for the character it helped you build? More importantly, how do you measure your own worth? By what you have or by who you've become in earning it? Because at the end of the day, the people who love you for your bank account will disappear when the money does. But the people who love you for your character, those relationships are worth more than all the wealth in the world. The story you just heard is fictional, but inspired by real events. I hope it makes you think about what truly matters in your own relationships and family. What would you have done in my situation? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. The greatest lesson from this family drama story isn't about money or betrayal. It's about the power of authentic love and patient wisdom. My mother taught me that true wealth lies not in what you accumulate, but in the character you build along the way. Don't make my mistake of being blinded by surface beauty and charm. I married someone who saw dollar signs instead of a life partner. Look beyond the facade. True love celebrates your struggles, not your bank account. God blessed me with a painful lesson that ultimately led to genuine happiness with Sarah, someone who values my heart over my inheritance. To parents listening, don't spoil your children with unearned wealth. My mother's decision to hide our fortune was the greatest gift she ever gave me. It forced me to develop work ethic, humility, and the satisfaction of earning my own success. When you remove struggle, you remove growth. God's plan often includes challenges that shape us into better people. Don't enable manipulative family members who see relationships as financial opportunities. These betrayal stories teach us that some people will exploit even sacred bonds like marriage for personal gain. Set boundaries, protect your peace, and remember that saying no to toxic behavior is saying yes to your family's well-being. The most profound family drama story isn't about conflict, it's about reconciliation, forgiveness, and choosing love over bitterness. God works through even our most painful experiences to bring us exactly where we need to be. My failed marriage led me to Sarah, and my mother's secret led us to a deeper, more honest relationship. These betrayal stories remind us that not everyone who enters our lives deserves to stay. Some people are lessons, not lifelong companions. Trust your instincts, value character over charisma, and never compromise your family's integrity for temporary peace. The Thomas Thompson Foundation continues my father's legacy, proving that the best family drama story endings involve healing purpose and service to others. Real wealth multiplies when shared with pure intentions. Your turn to share. Have you experienced similar betrayal in your family? How did you handle discovering someone's true motives? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else navigate their own challenges. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that inspire and educate. Hit that notification bell so you never miss content that could change your perspective on family love and life's most important lessons.